picture an ocean with nothing in it that can see. Nothing that can bite, nothing that can chase, grab, or kill. For over 3 billion years, that's what life on this planet looked like. Every living thing just drifted, absorbed nutrients, and existed in total peace on the ancient seafloor. But around 541 million years ago, something crawled out of the warm Cambrian mud that shattered that peace forever, and nothing on Earth has been the same since. This is the story of the first predator. To understand what that creature was and why it mattered, you have to go back to a period that doesn't even make it into most history classes. Not the age of dinosaurs, not the ice ages, way further back than any of that. We're going to the Ediacaran, a stretch of deep time between roughly 635 million years ago, and absolutely nothing about this world would feel familiar to you. Imagine standing on the shore of an ancient ocean. The air is thin and doesn't smell right. There are no trees, no grass, no insects buzzing past your ears, just barren rock and sand stretching in every direction, baked under a sun that looks slightly different from the one you know. The continents are clustered near the equator, in shapes you wouldn't recognize on any map. The sky carries a faint orange haze because the atmosphere isn't what you're used to breathing. There are no footprints on the beach, no bird calls overhead, and the silence is so complete it would unsettle you within seconds. But the water is a completely different story. Beneath the surface of those warm, shallow Ediacaran seas, life is everywhere. Not the kind of life you see in ocean documentaries, though. There are no fish darting between coral reefs, no sharks cruising through the blue, no octopuses tucked into rocky crevices. Instead, the ocean floor is carpeted with something that looks more like an alien garden than anything from our world. Strange, flat, quilted organisms called Dickinsonia sit on the sediment. Picture a ribbed oval pancake pressed into the mud, ranging from a few centimeters across to specimens nearly a meter wide. Scientists spent decades trying to figure out what these things even were. Some thought they were jellyfish, others called them worms or polyps. A few suggested they were mushrooms or lichens. One paleontologist proposed they belonged to an entirely unknown kingdom of life, something that wasn't plant, animal, or fungus. Dickinsonia had what you might call a long identity crisis. It was first described in 1947 from fossils found in the Ediacara Hills of South Australia, and for over 70 years, nobody could agree on where it fit in the tree of life. It wasn't until 2018, when chemical analysis of Dickinsonia fossils from Russia revealed traces of cholesterol, a fat molecule unique to animals, that scientists finally confirmed they were animals after all. The oldest confirmed members of our kingdom, lying flat on a quiet seafloor more than 500 million years ago. Near them, tall, fern-like fronds called Charnia sway gently in the ocean current. These organisms look like delicate underwater ferns, standing upright from the seafloor and branching into fractal patterns of repeating segments. However, they aren't plants. Many Charnia fossils come from deep water environments, far below the reach of sunlight, which means photosynthesis can't explain how they survived. They were likely absorbing dissolved organic nutrients directly from the water around them, feeding without a mouth, without a stomach, and without anything you'd recognize as a digestive system. Charnia has its own wild discovery story. In 1957, a 15-year-old schoolgirl named Tina Negus found what appeared to be a leaf-like impression in rock from Charnwood Forest in Leicestershire, England. She reported it, but nobody believed her because scientists at the time insisted that complex life couldn't have existed before the Cambrian period. The following year, a 16-year-old named Roger Mason found similar fossils in the same forest, and this time geologist Trevor Ford recognized their significance. His publication drew international attention and helped overturn one of the biggest assumptions in geology. Complex, multicellular organisms had existed millions of years before anyone thought possible. Scattered among the Dickinsonia and Charnia, other Ediacaran organisms dot the seafloor. Small, shield-shaped creatures called Pavancarina sit in the sediment, looking like tiny arrowheads. Tribrachidium, a disc-shaped organism with 3 radiating arms and a strange threefold symmetry found in no modern animal group, rests in clusters on the mud. Kimberella, a creature that resembles a flattened oval with a shell-like covering, leaves scratching marks on the microbial mats it feeds on, suggesting it could actually move and graze. This is the Ediacaran world, quiet, passive, and deeply strange. A garden of soft-bodied creatures with no eyes to see each other, no mouths to eat each other, and no reason to be afraid. For roughly 40 million years, this was the state of complex life on Earth. And if you'd been watching, there wouldn't have been a single sign that it was about to end, and then everything changed. Around 541 million years ago, the Ediacaran period ended, and what followed was the single most dramatic chapter in the entire history of life on Earth. Scientists call it the Cambrian Explosion, and the word explosion isn't an exaggeration. In a span of roughly 20 million years, which sounds long until you realize that life had been around for over 3 billion years before this point, nearly every major animal body plan that exists today appeared in the fossil record for the first time. 20 million years to produce the blueprints for insects, crustaceans, mollusks, worms, chordates, echinoderms, and dozens of other groups. After billions of years of single-celled organisms and quiet, soft-bodied Ediacaran creatures, the ocean suddenly filled with animals that had hard shells, jointed legs, segmented bodies, grasping claws, compound eyes, and mineralized teeth. The fossil evidence for this explosion comes primarily from two incredible deposits. The first is the Burgess Shale, a formation of dark mudstone high in the Canadian Rockies of British Columbia. Discovered by American paleontologist Charles Doolittle Walcott in 1909, the Burgess Shale preserves the soft tissues of Cambrian animals in stunning detail, capturing gills, intestines, and even neural tissue that would normally rot away to nothing. The Smithsonian Institution now houses over 65,000 Burgess Shale specimens. The second major deposit is the Chengjiang biota in Yunnan Province, China, which is roughly 10 million years older than the Burgess Shale and provides an even earlier window into the explosion. Together, these two fossil sites have given scientists a detailed picture of the most creative and violent period in evolutionary history. The question scientists have wrestled with for over a century is simple. Why then? What triggered the Cambrian explosion? Why did life spend billions of years doing basically nothing and then suddenly erupt into wild diversity? There's no single answer, but several factors converged during this period that made the explosion almost inevitable. Oxygen levels in the oceans rose, crossing a critical threshold of roughly 3% atmospheric concentration that allowed larger, more metabolically active organisms to survive. Below that threshold, complex food webs with predators at the top simply can't exist. Above it, they become possible. That crossing point probably happened right around 540 million years ago. The chemistry of the seas changed as well, making it easier for animals to build hard shells and mineralized skeletons out of calcium carbonate and calcium phosphate. Continents shifted and broke apart, opening new, shallow marine environments flooded with warm sunlight and nutrient-rich currents. Genetic studies suggest that many of the regulatory genes needed to build complex body plans, the so-called HOX genes that control how an animal develops from embryo to adult, were already in place by the late Ediacaran. The raw materials for an explosion were loaded and waiting. However, one factor stands above the rest. One trigger that, once it appeared, forced every living thing in the ocean to either adapt or die. Predation. For the first time in the history of life on Earth, one animal started hunting and eating another, and the arrival of active predators in those ancient oceans kicked off an evolutionary arms race that hasn't stopped from that moment to this one. Suddenly, soft-bodied creatures needed hard shells to avoid being crushed. Animals that couldn't see needed eyes to spot approaching danger. Organisms that had spent their entire existence sitting passively on the seafloor needed the ability to burrow into the mud, swim away fast, or develop chemical defenses. Every innovation we associate with complex animal life, from eyes and teeth to muscles and nervous systems, traces back to this single event, the moment something in the ocean decided to eat something else. And the creature sitting at the top of this brand new food chain was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Its name is Anomalocaris, which translates from Greek as abnormal shrimp, And if you're imagining a slightly bigger version of the shrimp on your dinner plate, you couldn't be more wrong. Anomalocaris was a monster by Cambrian standards. In a world where the vast majority of animals measured just a few centimeters long, roughly the size of a grape or a walnut, Anomalocaris could reach up to 1 meter in length. Some researchers think certain specimens may have grown even larger. To put that in perspective, imagine dropping a great white shark into a pond full of minnows. That's roughly the size advantage Anomalocaris held over everything else in the ocean. Nothing in the Cambrian had ever encountered anything that large, that fast, or that dangerous. Its body was elongated and segmented, built for speed in the water. Along each side ran a series of flexible lobes that undulated in rhythmic waves, propelling it through the Cambrian seas with a motion that probably looked something like a modern cuttlefish or a swimming ray. This wasn't an animal that sat around waiting for food to wander past. Anomalocaris was a pursuit predator, an active hunter that could chase down its prey with speed and precision that nothing else in the Cambrian could match. But the body was only the beginning. At the front of Anomalocaris, two enormous grasping appendages extended forward from either side of the head. Picture a pair of heavily armed tentacles, each one divided into segments and lined with sharp, inward-pointing spines that created a natural cage. When Anomalocaris closed these appendages around a trilobite or a soft-bodied worm, the interlocking spines made escape virtually impossible. Scientists studying the mechanics of these arms believe they were flexible enough to curl inward with serious force, capable of cracking the thin shells of early Cambrian arthropods and holding struggling prey in a grip that wasn't letting go. And the mouth was built to finish the job. Located on the underside of the head, the mouth of Anomalocaris was a circular disc made up of 32 overlapping plates. 4 large ones formed the main ring, with 28 smaller plates filling the gaps between them. The whole assembly looked like a pineapple ring, with the center replaced by a circle of serrated prongs pointing inward. This mouth could constrict, squeezing and crushing prey between the overlapping plates, but it couldn't fully close. There was always a small opening at the center, and the tooth-like prongs continued down the walls of the throat, which meant that once something went into that mouth, it wasn't coming back out. Fossilized feces attributed to Anomalocaris have been found containing fragments of trilobite exoskeletons, providing direct evidence that this thing was actively feeding on the armored residents of the Cambrian seafloor. Now, more recent research from the Natural History Museum in London has complicated this picture a bit. A 2023 study suggested that the grasping appendages of Anomalocaris might not have been strong enough to crack the harder trilobite shells. Instead, this predator may have gone after soft-bodied prey, targeting the unarmored worms, small arthropods and other vulnerable creatures that still made up a huge portion of the Cambrian food web. The trilobite shell fragments in the fossilized feces might have come from softer-shelled juveniles, or from molting trilobites that had temporarily shed their armor. Either way, Anomalocaris was a killer. The debate is just about what exactly it killed most efficiently. Now, here's where the story gets truly staggering. In 2011, a team of researchers led by John Patterson from the University of New England in Australia announced a discovery that stunned the paleontology world. Working with fossils from the 515-million-year-old Emu Bay Shale on Kangaroo Island in South Australia, they found something that had never been preserved before in the fossil record: the eyes of Anomalocaris. And these weren't simple eyes. The Emu Bay Shale is a unique geological formation. The fine-grained mudstone formed in an environment that was essentially devoid of oxygen at the time of burial, which meant the microbes that normally break down soft tissue after death couldn't do their work. Organic structures that would have decayed and vanished in any normal fossil deposit were instead preserved in stunning detail, including the fragile visual surfaces of compound eyes. Each eye was up to 3 centimeters across, and the preserved visual surfaces showed more than 16,000 individual hexagonally packed lenses arranged in a tight, honeycomb-like pattern. To put that number in perspective, the common housefly has about 3,000 lenses in its compound eyes. Most ants have fewer than 1,000. The only living animal that comes close to matching the visual acuity of Anomalocaris is the modern dragonfly, which has roughly 28,000 lenses per eye and is considered one of the sharpest-eyed predators in the insect world. Anomalocaris, swimming through Cambrian seas 500 million years ago, had vision that rivaled some of the best hunters alive today. Its eyesight was approximately 30 times more acute than trilobite eyes, which had been considered the best in the Cambrian up to that point. Trilobites could sense changes in light and dark and detect large movements. Anomalocaris could track movement, judge distance, and pick out individual prey items against the background of the seafloor with surgical precision. As John Patterson put it, such lens-rich compound eyes suggest Anomalocaris was a highly visual hunter. Its prey did not stand a chance. And he wasn't exaggerating. The preservation of those eyes also solved a long-standing mystery about the animal's evolutionary identity. The compound eye structure proved conclusively that Anomalocaris was an arthropod, a relative of modern insects, crabs, spiders, and lobsters. Yet the discovery revealed something even more surprising about the timeline of evolution itself. Those insanely sophisticated eyes had evolved before the animal developed jointed legs or a hardened external skeleton. In other words, Anomalocaris could see better than most modern arthropods, but its body was still largely soft. Vision came first, body armor came later, and that tells you everything about what mattered most during the Cambrian Explosion. In a world where predation had just been invented, being able to see your prey or see your predator was worth more than any shell, more than raw speed, more than sheer size. Eyes were the ultimate currency, and Anomalocaris had the best ones in the ocean. But if the anatomy and vision of Anomalocaris are impressive, the story of how scientists actually figured out what this animal was might be the most fascinating part of all. Because for nearly a century nobody knew Anomalocaris existed as a single creature. Its body parts were sitting in separate museum drawers on different continents, and every single piece had been classified as a completely different animal. The saga started in 1892, when Canadian paleontologist Joseph Frederick Whiteaves examined a strange fossil from the Ogogosis shale in British Columbia. It was a curved, segmented structure that looked like the tail or abdomen of a crustacean, something resembling a headless shrimp. He named it Anomalocaris, meaning abnormal shrimp, because while it looked like a shrimp body, it didn't match any known species. Around the same time, other pieces of the puzzle turned up without anyone realizing they were connected. Charles Doolittle Walcott, the legendary American paleontologist who would go on to discover the Burgess Shale in 1909, found a circular disc-shaped fossil with radiating plates. It looked like a jellyfish, so he classified it as one and stuck it in a new genus he called Paeotoia. In the same batch of Burgess Shale material, Walcott also found another segmented appendage, but he didn't notice the similarities to Whiteaves' earlier discovery and instead classified it as the feeding limb of an entirely different Cambrian animal called Sydneya. And the body of the creature itself? When Walcott found that, he described it as a type of sea cucumber and placed it in yet another genus called Lagania. So at this point in paleontological history, scientists had the grasping arm, the mouth, a feeding appendage, and parts of the body of Anomalocaris, all sitting in separate museum collections, labelled as four entirely different creatures: a shrimp, a jellyfish, a piece of Sydneya, and a sea cucumber. The largest predator of the Cambrian oceans had been dismembered by taxonomy, and nobody even realized they were looking at one animal. This confusion lasted for decades. In 1928, Danish paleontologist Kai Henriksen tried to reconstruct Anomalocaris by attaching the shrimp-like appendage to the carapace of another Burgess Shale arthropod called Tuzoia, creating a hybrid animal that never existed in nature. Artists followed this flawed interpretation in their scientific illustrations, and for years, the picture of Anomalocaris in museum displays and textbooks was completely wrong. The breakthrough didn't come until the late 1970s and early 1980s, when the Geological Survey of Canada launched a comprehensive re-examination of the Burgess Shale fossil collections. Cambridge University paleontologist Harry Whittington led the effort, assisted by his two graduate students, Simon Conway Morris and Derek Briggs. This team would completely reshape our understanding of Cambrian life, but not without making a few mistakes of their own along the way. In 1978, Conway Morris re-examined the jellyfish Peytoia and realized that its mouth parts were identical to those found in Walcott's sea cucumber Lagania. But rather than recognizing them as parts of one animal, he concluded that the Lagania specimen was a composite fossil, a chance superimposition of the jellyfish on top of a sponge. Close, but not quite right. In 1979, Briggs made a critical breakthrough. He realized that the fossils originally called Anomalocaris weren't abdomens or tails at all. They were appendages, grasping arms belonging to some unknown, much larger animal. The full picture, however, still hadn't come together. The final piece fell into place when Whittington was preparing what he thought was an unrelated Burgess Shale specimen. Using a modified dental drill under a binocular microscope, he started chipping away layers of rock to reveal hidden structures beneath the surface. What he found was staggering. Below the rock lay the complete body of a single large animal, and attached to that body were the shrimp arms, the jellyfish mouth, and the Sydney feeding appendage. All of them belonged to the same creature. In 1985, Whittington and Briggs published the landmark paper that finally assembled the puzzle after 93 years of confusion. Anomalocaris wasn't a headless shrimp, it was the largest animal in the Cambrian seas, a streamlined predator whose body parts had been misidentified and scattered across the scientific literature for nearly a century. An entire apex predator had been hiding in plain sight, chopped up and filed under the wrong names. If you're finding this journey through deep time fascinating, take a second to hit subscribe. We cover the epic and forgotten history of life on Earth every week, and there's a lot more ahead in this one. Now, as formidable as Anomalocaris was, it didn't hunt alone in the Cambrian seas. The oceans of this period were packed with creatures so bizarre, so alien in their design, that modern scientists have spent decades just trying to classify them. Take Opabinia. This small animal, only about 7 centimeters long, is possibly the strangest creature ever pulled out of a rock. Opabinia had 5 mushroom-shaped eyes, arranged in a row across the top of its head, giving it a panoramic view of its surroundings that no modern animal can match. Extending from the front of its head was a long, flexible proboscis, about a third of its total body length, that ended in a grasping claw. Think of an elephant's trunk crossed with a pair of pliers. Scientists believe Opabinia used this bizarre tool to probe the mud of the ancient seafloor, grabbing small worms and other soft-bodied prey and passing them backward to a mouth located on the underside of its head, facing toward the rear of its body. Yes, its mouth faced backward. The creature was so unlike anything alive today that when paleontologist Harry Whittington first presented his detailed reconstruction of Opabinia at a scientific conference in 1975, the audience reportedly burst into laughter. They thought he was joking. Nobody believed an animal with 5 eyes, a claw-tipped vacuum hose for a nose, and a backward-facing mouth could have actually existed. But the Burgess Shale fossils proved them wrong, and Opabinia became one of the poster children for the Cambrian Explosion's alien creativity. Then there was Hallucigenia, a creature whose name literally means hallucination creature, because its discoverer thought it looked like something from a fever dream. Hallucigenia was tiny, about 3 centimeters long, with a row of paired spines along its back and delicate legs tipped with claws on its underside. But when Simon Conway Morris first reconstructed Hallucigenia in the 1970s, he got the entire animal upside down. He put the rigid spines on the bottom, interpreting them as stilt-like walking legs, and the actual floppy legs on top, calling them tentacles. For nearly 2 decades, this inverted version appeared in textbooks and museum displays around the world. It wasn't until the 1990s that scientists in China found better preserved specimens and realized the mistake. The animal was flipped, the spines were defensive armor, and the soft, clawed appendages were the actual walking legs. And, in 2015, researchers using electron microscopy discovered that Hallucigenia had a small, round head with a pair of simple eyes and a ring of needle-like teeth around its throat. Features that had been overlooked for decades because they were so tiny and so well hidden in the rock. And then there was Pikaia, a creature that looked almost disappointingly ordinary next to its 5-eyed, spike-covered, claw-armed neighbors. Pikaia was a small, eel-like swimmer, about 5 centimeters long, with a flattened, ribbon-shaped body and V-shaped muscle blocks running along its sides. It had no claws, no armor, and no impressive eyes. Frankly, it looked like the kind of animal that would end up as somebody else's lunch. But Pikaia might be the single most important animal in this entire story. Because running along its back was a flexible rod called a notochord, the defining structural feature of a group called the chordates. Chordates are the group that includes every animal with a backbone on Earth, from fish and amphibians to reptiles, birds, mammals, and yes, humans. Pikaia was swimming through the same Cambrian seas as Anomalocaris. It lived in the same ecosystem, dodged the same predators, competed for the same scraps on the ancient seafloor. If that humble little swimmer had been grabbed by the wrong grasping appendage on the wrong afternoon, the entire vertebrate lineage, including every person watching this right now, might never have existed. That's the Cambrian for you. A world where a single missed meal could reshape the future of life on Earth. But the impact of Anomalocaris goes way beyond its own lifetime. The arrival of a large, visually guided, active predator in the Cambrian oceans didn't just threaten the animals that were alive at the time. It rewired how evolution worked for every generation that followed. Before predation, the main pressures on living organisms were environmental. Could you survive the temperature? Could you find enough nutrients? Could you handle changes in ocean chemistry? Those are slow, passive challenges that produce slow, passive adaptations over vast stretches of time. Predation is different. Predation is immediate, personal, and lethal. It creates a feedback loop where every defensive adaptation by the prey forces a counter-adaptation by the predator, and every offensive improvement by the predator forces the prey to evolve again. Scientists call this an evolutionary arms race, and once it starts, it accelerates change at a rate that environmental pressures alone could never drive. Consider what happened in the Cambrian oceans once Anomalocaris and its relatives showed up. The results were staggering. Animals that had spent their entire evolutionary history as soft, unprotected organisms on the open seafloor suddenly needed armor. Trilobites, those iconic Cambrian arthropods with their segmented bodies and compound eyes, developed hard mineralized exoskeletons made of calcite crystals, turning their bodies into interlocking shields that could resist crushing force. Some trilobite species evolved the ability to curl into a tight ball like a modern pill bug, tucking their soft undersides behind a wall of interlocking thoracic plates. Others grew elaborate spines, ridges, and knobs projecting from their bodies that made them harder to grip and a lot more painful to swallow. Burrowing behavior exploded. The trace fossil record shows a dramatic increase in complex burrow systems right around the Ediacaran Cambrian boundary. Animals that had previously lived on the surface of the seafloor started digging into the sediment to hide from predators, creating networks of tunnels that had never existed before. And this burrowing revolution had cascading effects that went way beyond the animals doing the digging. The churning of sediment mixed oxygenated surface water into deeper layers of mud, changed the nutrient cycling of the ocean floor, and restructured the physical environment in ways that created entirely new ecological niches. Eyes evolved with explosive speed. The Cambrians saw the first appearance of sophisticated compound eyes in trilobites, and within a geologically short span, visual systems became increasingly complex and varied across dozens of animal lineages. Biologist Andrew Parker proposed what he called the light switch hypothesis, arguing that the evolution of the eye was itself one of the primary triggers of the Cambrian explosion. Once one lineage of animals could see, the dynamics of the ocean changed overnight in evolutionary terms. Camouflage became valuable, warning colors appeared, animals started detecting predators from a distance and reacting before contact, and natural selection responded by producing incredibly sharp eyes in a shockingly short window of time. Swimming got faster. Animals developed streamlined body plans, paired fins for lateral stability, and muscular tails for rapid bursts of acceleration. The ocean wasn't a place where you could sit still and absorb nutrients anymore. It was a battlefield, and every organism in it was either predator, prey, or something trying desperately to be neither. The Ediacaran creatures, those soft, passive, quilted organisms that had dominated the seafloor for millions of years, disappeared almost entirely at the Cambrian boundary. They had no shells, no eyes, and no ability to flee, fight, or hide. In a world without predators, none of that mattered. In a world with Anomalocaris, it was a death sentence. The biotic replacement model suggests that the rise of active predatory animals directly caused the extinction of the older Ediacaran forms by destroying the microbial mat ecosystems they depended on and eating the defenseless creatures themselves. The tranquil garden got replaced by a killing field, and the soft-bodied Ediacaran world never came back. Anomalocaris itself wasn't a one-off oddity either. It belonged to a larger group of animals called radiodonts, a clade of stem lineage arthropods that were among the most widespread and ecologically diverse predators of the early Paleozoic oceans. First reported in 1892 with the original description of Anomalocaris canadensis. Radiodonts are now known from fossil sites spanning every continent, from the Burgess Shale in the Canadian Rockies to the Chengjiang fossil beds in Yunnan Province, China, the Emu Bay Shale on Kangaroo Island, and formations in Greenland, Morocco, Utah, and beyond. Different species filled completely different ecological roles, which tells you this wasn't just a one-trick group. Some, like Anomalocaris canadensis, were active visual hunters that chased down prey with their grasping appendages. Others went in a completely different direction. Ediacaran evolved frontal appendages with fine, closely spaced spines that worked as filter-feeding rakes, sweeping through the water column and sieving tiny organisms in a way that looks almost identical to how modern baleen whales strain krill from the sea. The group also included Herdia, a relative of Anomalocaris, with a large frontal carapace that probably worked as both predator and scavenger on the Cambrian seafloor. Radiodonts persisted for roughly 50 million years, spanning from the early Cambrian through the early Ordovician, before gradually declining and going extinct. Their disappearance coincided with the rise of other large marine predators, including the giant cephalopods and predatory arthropods that would dominate Paleozoic oceans for ages to come, but the extinction of the radiodonts didn't erase their impact. Not even close. The ecological dynamics that Anomalocaris and its relatives introduced to the Cambrian oceans, the predator-prey arms race, the pressure for speed and vision and armor and evasion, continued shaping the trajectory of life on this planet for the next 500 million years. Every predator that came after them built on the foundation they established. The giant sea scorpions of the Silurian and Devonian, the armored placoderm fish like Dunkleosteus with their massive bone-crushing jaws, the ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs of the Mesozoic seas, the great white sharks, orca whales, and saltwater crocodiles of the modern world. Every single one of those predators exists because the arms race that Anomalocaris started in the Cambrian Ocean never stopped. That's the real significance of the first predator. It's not just a curiosity from deep time, or a weird fossil to stare at in a museum. It's the reason complex life looks the way it does, the reason you have forward-facing eyes that judge distance, the reason your distant ancestors developed spines to protect a nervous system that needed to process threats in real time, the reason speed, intelligence, and the ability to be afraid became the dominant currencies of survival across the entire animal kingdom. 500 million years ago, a creature the length of your forearm swam through warm, sunlit, shallow water and started actively hunting the animals around it. The oceans had been peaceful for 3 billion years before that moment. They haven't been peaceful since. The Burgess Shale fossils from the Canadian Rockies sit in museums around the world, preserved in slabs of dark shale that split apart like the pages of a book written in stone. The Chengjiang fossils from southern China lie in clay-rich mudstones that capture soft tissues with a level of detail that still catches researchers off guard. The Emu Bay Shale specimens from Kangaroo Island preserve the individual lenses of compound eyes that last saw the glow of sunlight filtering through ancient seawater over 500 million years ago. You split those rocks open with a hammer and chisel, and something that's been sleeping since before fish existed is suddenly staring back at you. And that something had 16,000 lenses, a mouth that couldn't close, and arms designed to grab anything that moved. Welcome to the Cambrian. Nothing was safe, and everything that survived learned the same lesson. If you can't run, hide, fight, or grow a shell, you're not going to make it. 500 million years later, That lesson still applies to every living thing on the planet, including you. If this deep dive into prehistoric life blew your mind, check out the video on screen. It covers more ancient creatures and forgotten chapters of life on Earth that rarely get talked about. Trust me, you don't want to miss it.